I think now the culture wars means something very, very different, and the context is very different, particularly in Britain, where the religious right doesn't really have that kind of authority. The state is not really driven by kind of mad evangelists or anti-abortion campaigners. I think there is a myth that the right is really in the ascendancy and is controlling all the apparatus of the state. I think the opposite has happened, and I've written quite a lot about this. I think the liberal left, for want of a better phrase, and I know that doesn't quite capture the complexity of it, but the liberal left has taken over many of the institutions of the state, and in my view is doing exactly what the right did in the 1980s, in that it's trying to clamp down on dissent and dissenting opinion. And for someone like me who, when I was growing up, I called myself of the left, I thought of myself as left wing. I realised very quickly in my 20s that the one thing that the left, as it was presenting itself, was not in favour of was free speech, that there was an intolerance about different ideas and opinions. And that's, I think, the real battle of the culture wars now. I think there is a tendency to want to close down debate in the name of protecting minorities and the marginalised. And in doing so, I think it has alienated a very large number of people, both the white majority and ethnic minorities and other groups.
Afua, how much of that how much of that are you prepared to go with, and what would you dissent from?
I have a different perspective, you won't be surprised to hear from Munira. And I actually, when you talk about the kind of origins of culture wars, I relate more closely to its roots in the 1980s than what you were describing now, because I think when you look at mainstream politics now, I'm of a generation, I was 16 when New Labour won the general election in 1996. 1997, sorry. 1997, I was 16. And I think for my generation, the traditional divisions of left and right have never really been that relevant in our political lives. What have been the divides are the questions of who belongs and who doesn't, the narrative about who we are as a nation. And the primary struggle for my life has been being able to work out whether somebody like me, who was born and grew up in Britain, can actually claim Britishness as my identity. And I think that very individual struggle that I've had is something I'm seeing played out in an unprecedented scale on a national and actually a global level. So I didn't think I would ever start by citing Milo Yiannopoulos. But one thing that he said, talking about Trump, is that he was a cultural candidate. And that really resonates with me. I think Brexit was a cultural election. We are fighting over the questions of who we are, what our identity, collective and individual identities are, and on what we base them. And so for me, that is at the basis of this tension that is so polarising.
And if you do accept this idea, this phrase culture war, what are the battlegrounds, do you think?
Well, elections at the moment, for one thing.
Lots of people argue that there's been a sort of tremendous liberalisation in this country over the last 30 years, not exactly since 97, but even predating that. And that there's that great liberalisation has transformed the attitudes of perhaps as many as 3/4 of the population. Do you recognise that change, or do you think that's an accurate characterisation of what's happened in this country?
Yes and no. So when I hear the stories of people who grew up in the 70s, I do not recognise the hostility, overt hostility and discrimination.
It's a lot better than the 70s, yeah.
Yeah, I 100% recognise that things have improved. And that's actually one reason why when people are nostalgic for kind of the pre-EU era in Britain, I don't relate to it, because from what I hear, you were getting chased down the street by teddy boys. And one of the reasons many black people I know were happy about Europe was the idea that you have this extra layer of protection from right-wing British governments that might subvert your rights. So I think that we have improved.
I think Afua's absolutely right that we're terrified of talking about race and identity, and there is a sort of self-consciousness and a defensiveness in the parts of people who run our institutions and so on. They feel guilty, and that comes across definitely in conversation. I think you write that really, really well. But that is because of a kind of political change where I would say parts of the liberal left have made it impossible to talk about race and have made it about a struggle between black and white, and have essentially differentiated the population. And I think that has become more divisive and less conducive to really honest conversation, because essentially a lot of white people are made to feel guilty about inequality, and are made to feel it's somehow their fault.
So, given that you characterise the improvements that have taken place, how do we account for the ferocity of this, of identity politics? Why is it so fierce?
Well, it's a very interesting question. I suspect part of it is to do with a change in left-wing politics and the old debates between whether you would have a more socialist approach to running society and the state. That those arguments, I think, with the fall of the Berlin Wall and with the wider change in the global political sphere, that those arguments started to run out of steam. They started to lose their purchase in the public. And that's why the rise of the new left and a particular approach to focusing on identity, on the personal as political, that became much stronger as a tendency in the left.